There's a particular kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep fixes. You know the one. It is not the tiredness that comes from working too hard or staying up too late or pushing your body beyond its limits. It is something deeper than that, something that lives in a place sleep cannot reach. The exhaustion of someone who has been performing a version of themselves carefully, continuously, for years, that is just slightly removed from who they actually are. The exhaustion of always knowing what everyone else in the room is feeling, of carrying that awareness like an invisible weight that no one else seems to notice you're holding, of being the one who senses the tension before anyone has spoken a word, who feels the subtle shift in someone's energy across a room, who absorbs the emotional atmosphere of every environment they enter, not as a choice, but as an automatic, unstoppable, deeply exhausting fact of their existence. If this is familiar, if you have spent most of your life feeling everything around you with an intensity that most people don't seem to share, and simultaneously spending enormous energy managing how you respond to what you feel, then this conversation is for you. Not because you need to be fixed, not because your sensitivity is the problem to be solved, but because there's something happening beneath that sensitivity, something that trauma-informed psychology, and particularly the work of Dr. Gabor Maté, illuminates with extraordinary clarity, that most conversations about empaths completely miss. And missing it is costing you more than you may realize. The word empath has become something of a cultural phenomenon. It appears everywhere, in self-help books, in online communities, in conversations about relationships and emotional intelligence, and the particular difficulty of being a highly sensitive person in a world that does not always reward sensitivity. And within those conversations, empaths are typically described in ways that feel validating and accurate to the people who identify with the label. They feel deeply, they absorb others' emotions, they are attuned to subtlety, they care intensely, they give generously, they struggle with boundaries, they often feel overwhelmed in social environments. They frequently find themselves in the role of the helper, the listener, the one others turn to in difficulty. All of this is real. All of it describes something genuine about a particular quality of human experience. But here's what most of those conversations fail to examine. For many of the people who identify as empaths, for many of the people whose sensitivity is real and whose capacity for emotional attunement is genuine, there is something else also present, something that sits beneath the sensitivity, and that, when honestly examined, reveals itself to be not a gift, but a wound. Or more precisely, a wound that produced the gift, in a way that the most costly adaptations often do. That something is the early, often unconscious learning that emotional attunement to others is not just a natural human capacity to be enjoyed and developed. It is a survival strategy, a necessary and life-sustaining skill developed in an environment where tracking other people's emotional states, reading the room, anticipating the shift in mood, sensing danger before it arrived, was not a luxury but a requirement. Gabor Mate's framework offers the clearest language available for this distinction. The child who grows up in an emotionally unpredictable environment, whose caregiver's moods were volatile, or whose love was conditional, or whose emotional presence was inconsistent enough to create chronic, low-grade anxiety in the child, develops an acute sensitivity to emotional cues. Not because they were born more sensitive than other children, though some degree of temperamental difference may be present, but because their nervous system learned, through thousands of experiences of emotional unpredictability, that attending carefully to how others feel is the most important information available. The child who could read a parent's mood accurately, who could sense the irritability before it became an outburst, who could feel the withdrawal before it became emotional abandonment, who could calibrate their own behavior in advance to prevent the worst outcomes. That child was safer than a child who could not. The sensitivity in this context was not a personality trait, it was a survival adaptation, extraordinarily refined, extraordinarily effective, and extraordinarily costly, because it developed at the expense of an equal attention to the child's own inner experience. And that child grew up and brought all of it with them. This is the truth that most conversations about empaths are not quite willing to say directly. That for many deeply sensitive, highly attuned, emotionally generous people, the sensitivity and the people pleasing are not separate phenomena. They are two expressions of the same underlying adaptation, the same survival strategy, operating through two different channels. The sensitivity reads the room, the people pleasing responds to what the sensitivity reads. Together, they form a system so efficient and so automated that by adulthood, it no longer feels like a strategy, it feels like a self. It feels like who you are. And here's where the most important question in this entire conversation becomes possible to ask. What happens when the empath, the person who has spent years, possibly decades, in this particular configuration, begins to see it clearly? When the automatic attunement to everyone else's needs begins to be met for the first time with equal, honest attention to what is actually happening inside. What happens when the person who has always been able to feel everything around them turns that same quality of attention genuinely, honestly, without deflection inward? What they find there is often not what they expected. The first thing many people discover when they stop people pleasing and start looking honestly at their own experience is that a significant portion of what they believed was empathy was actually anxiety. Not all of it. The empathy is real. The genuine care for others is real. The authentic desire to contribute to the well-being of the people they love is real. But woven into it, so thoroughly interwoven that separating the threads feels almost impossible at first, is fear. The specific, automated, nervous system level fear of what will happen if someone is unhappy, of what disconnection feels like, of what it means when someone withdraws or is disappointed or shifts in their availability. For the person whose early environment made other people's emotional states genuinely relevant to their own safety, this fear is not irrational. It is the intelligent response of a nervous system that learned accurately that emotional weather in the environment has direct consequences. The problem is that the nervous system does not automatically update its threat assessment when the context changes. The adult who is no longer a child in an unpredictable environment, who is no longer genuinely dependent on a volatile caregiver for survival, still runs the old program, still treats other people's emotional states as information relevant to personal safety, still mobilizes the same attunement, the same accommodation, the same careful management of self-expression in contexts where none of it is actually necessary. And the moment this becomes visible, the moment the person begins to see that what felt like empathy has also been fear, is one of the most disorienting experiences in the entire healing journey. Because it requires holding two things simultaneously: the genuineness of the care and the fear that was always running beneath it, not choosing one or the other, not deciding that because fear was present, the care was therefore false, but sitting with the complexity, the both and, the deeply human reality of a self that is simultaneously genuinely loving and chronically, quietly terrified. From a trauma-informed perspective, this recognition is not a reason for shame, it is a reason for compassion. Because the fear was not weakness, it was an accurate response to an environment that was genuinely unpredictable. And the person who developed it was not choosing anxiety over authenticity, they were surviving with everything they had. The second thing people discover when they stop pleasing and start seeing clearly is perhaps even more confronting. They begin to notice who in their life has been benefiting from their self-erasure. This is delicate territory, and it deserves to be handled with honesty, rather than with the kind of black and white framing that characterizes so many conversations about relationships and healing. Because the people who have benefited from the empath's people-pleasing are not necessarily villains. They are not necessarily conscious manipulators who deliberately sought out someone to exploit. Many of them are simply people who, through their own unexamined patterns, their own unresolved histories, their own adaptations to their own early environments, found in the empath a relational dynamic that was comfortable, that required nothing particularly difficult from them, that provided the experience of being understood, accommodated, and cared for without the reciprocal demand to provide the same. Not because they were bad people, but because they were in their own way also running old programs, also living within the constraints of nervous systems shaped by experiences they never chose. And the dynamic between the empath and these people, the dynamic that both parties often unconsciously co-created, was stable precisely because it required the empath to keep showing up as the one who gives and the other person to keep showing up as the one who receives. When the empath begins to change, when they begin to have limits, to express needs, to show up as a full person rather than as a function, this dynamic becomes unstable. And the people who are most comfortable within it tend to feel, with varying degrees of consciousness, that something has gone wrong. They may express this as concern, as confusion, as the gentle or not so gentle suggestion that the empath is becoming selfish, that they have changed in ways that are difficult, that the version of them that had no needs was easier to love. And hearing this, particularly from people whose love and acceptance has been organized around the condition of accommodation, can feel devastating to someone early in the process of healing. It can feel like confirmation of the oldest fear, that the real self, the one with needs, with limits, with an inner life that sometimes differs from what others want, is not lovable. That the only version of them that could be loved was the version that had already disappeared into everyone else's needs. Gabor Maté's work offers a framework that helps hold this painful moment with more clarity. The love that requires your self-erasure as its condition is not the kind of love that can genuinely nourish you. It is a relationship with the adaptive self, with the performance, not with the person beneath the performance. And while that distinction does not make the loss of it painless, it does make the loss of it meaningful. It transforms what can feel like rejection into something more honest. Not rejection of the real self, discomfort with its emergence. These are very different things. And knowing the difference matters enormously. The third discovery, and perhaps the most quietly revolutionary, is what the empath finds when they turn honest attention toward their own needs for the first time. For many people who have spent years in the configuration described here, exquisitely attuned to everyone else, relatively disconnected from themselves, this inward turn produces something unexpected, not a clear, fully formed sense of self waiting to be uncovered, not an immediate knowledge of what they want, who they are, what genuinely matters to them beneath all the accommodation. That clarity for most people takes time to develop. It is not a destination arrived at in a single moment of revelation. What they find first is often something quieter and more uncomfortable, a kind of blankness where self-knowledge should be, a genuine unfamiliarity with their own inner landscape, the strange, slightly disorienting experience of asking themselves what they want and not having a ready answer. Not because the answer doesn't exist, but because the question has so rarely been directed inward that the pathways toward its answer have not been sufficiently developed. This experience, this initial encounter with one's own unfamiliarity, can feel alarming. It can be misread as evidence that the self is empty, that beneath all the giving and the caring and the emotional attunement, there is nothing particularly real. But from a developmental psychology perspective, this blankness is not emptiness. It is the predictable result of a self that has been persistently oriented outward toward the needs and states and preferences of others for so long that its inward-facing capacities are simply less practiced, less developed, not absent, not destroyed, simply waiting for the attention that has always been available to redirect toward them. And as that attention gradually, imperfectly, begins to turn inward, as the person begins to ask the question, what do I feel? What do I need? What do I actually want? With genuine curiosity rather than dismissal, something begins to emerge, slowly, tentatively, often without the clarity or the completeness that would be most comfortable, but unmistakably a self, distinct, real, with genuine preferences and genuine limits and a genuine inner life that has been patiently, persistently present beneath all of the accommodation, beneath all of the people pleasing, beneath all of the years of exquisite attention to everyone except itself. There's a particular moment in this process that many people describe with a quality of quiet astonishment. It is the moment they realize that the people they could never say no to, the people whose emotional states they have spent years managing, whose needs they have consistently prioritized over their own, are capable of handling more than the empath ever gave them credit for. That when the limit was finally expressed, however anxiously, however imperfectly, however surrounded by qualifications and apologies, the anticipated catastrophe did not arrive. The person adjusted, the relationship held, or the relationship revealed itself to be precisely as conditional as the fear had always suspected, and that revelation, however painful, was its own kind of information, its own kind of clarity. Because the fear that drove the people-pleasing, the ancient, automated, nervous system level fear that authenticity will cost you the connection, is a prediction. And like all predictions, it can be tested, not all at once, not recklessly, but gradually, carefully, in the accumulation of small moments of authentic self-expression, met with a response that differs from what the nervous system predicted. And each moment in which the prediction fails to materialize, each moment in which the no was said and the world did not end, in which the need was expressed and the relationship survived, in which the authentic self took up slightly more space and was met with acceptance rather than abandonment, deposits something in the nervous system, something that cannot be acquired through intellectual understanding alone, the direct, embodied, physically felt experience that it is safe to be real. That safety does not arrive all at once. It is built incrementally, one honest moment at a time, one imperfect expression of genuine self at a time, one small refusal of the old accommodation at a time, but it builds. And as it builds, something else builds alongside it. Trust in the self, in the self's own perceptions, in the self's right to exist, not as a function, not as a provider of emotional labor, not as the person who holds everything together at the expense of their own inner life, but simply as a person, full, real, deserving of the same quality of honest attention and genuine care that has always been so readily extended to everyone else. What happens when the empath stops pleasing everyone and starts seeing the truth? The first thing that happens is discomfort. Real, significant, sometimes overwhelming discomfort. The discomfort of changing a pattern that has been in operation for most of a lifetime. Of saying things that the old self would never have said. Of tolerating other people's disappointment without immediately mobilizing every resource to make it better. Of sitting with the specific anxiety of having been more authentically yourself than felt safe, and not yet having enough evidence that the safety is real. This discomfort is not a sign that something's going wrong. It is the sign of a nervous system in genuine transition. Moving, however haltingly, however painfully, from the old configuration towards something more honest, more sustainable, more genuinely alive. The second thing that happens is grief. Real, necessary grief for the years spent in accommodation, for the authentic self that went unheard for so long, for the relationships that were organized around a version of you that wasn't fully real, for the needs that went unvoiced and unmet across years of prioritizing everyone else's, For the child who learned that their realness was a problem to be managed rather than a self to be celebrated. This grief deserves to be felt, not rushed through, not managed into something more comfortable. Felt in all of its weight, with all of its complexity, as the honest acknowledgement of what was genuinely lost and what genuinely mattered. And then, not immediately, not in place of the grief, but alongside it and eventually beyond it, the third thing that happens, something that is difficult to name precisely because it has been absent for so long, that most people do not have reliable language for it, a quality of presence, of being genuinely inside your own life rather than perpetually managing it from a careful distance, of moving through relationships with something available that has not been available before, the real self, the one that is not performing, not accommodating, not running the ancient calculation of what configuration of myself will keep this person most comfortable. Simply present, simply honest, simply here, and discovering with a surprise that itself speaks to how thoroughly the old belief was held, that this version, the real one, is not too much, is not unlovable, is not the disaster the nervous system always predicted it would be, is in fact more genuinely connected, more genuinely seen, more genuinely in relationship than the performance ever managed to be. Because you cannot be genuinely known while you are hiding. And the people pleasing, however kind it appeared on the surface, was always a form of hiding, the most sophisticated kind, the kind that hid behind generosity, behind care, behind the appearance of being completely present for others while being almost entirely absent from oneself. Gabor Maté's work returns again and again to a central insight that carries its full weight only when it is felt rather than simply understood. Healing is not the creation of a new self, it is the recovery of the one that was always there. Beneath the accommodation, beneath the people pleasing, beneath the exquisite attunement to everyone else's emotional reality that became so practiced it felt like the whole of who you are. There is a self that was present before any of this began, before the environment required you to suppress it, before you learned that your authenticity was a risk the connection could not afford. Before the sensitivity that was simply yours, natural, genuine, part of how you came into the world, was recruited into the service of survival and became something more compulsive than natural. That self did not disappear. It was suppressed, patiently, persistently, for as long as necessary, and it has been waiting. In the quietest part of your experience, in the moments between the accommodation and the next request, in the brief, barely noticed flickers of genuine preference and genuine feeling and genuine response that surfaced sometimes even through the performance. It has been waiting for exactly what you are beginning, however tentatively, however imperfectly, to offer it, your honest attention, your genuine curiosity, your willingness to turn toward it, toward yourself, with the same quality of care and compassion that you have always found so natural to extend to everyone else. That turning inward, honest, compassionate, and long overdue is not selfishness. It is, perhaps, the most genuinely generous thing you have ever done. Because a self that knows itself, that is honest about what it feels, clear about what it needs, grounded in who it actually is, brings something to every relationship that the performing, accommodating, people-pleasing self never could: genuine presence. And genuine presence is the only foundation on which genuine connection has ever actually been built. Healing rarely announces itself. It tends to arrive in small, quiet moments that are easy to miss if you're waiting for something more dramatic. It arrives in the pause before the automatic yes. In the moment you notice the familiar anxiety and choose, just this once, to stay with it rather than immediately resolve it through accommodation. In the conversation where you say something true and feel the specific terror of having been real, and then discover slowly that the sky did not fall. It arrives in a growing capacity to be with yourself, to sit in your own company without the restlessness that used to send you immediately outward towards someone else's needs. To ask what you feel and stay long enough to hear something approach an answer. It arrives eventually in relationships that feel different from the ones that came before. Not because you have found perfect people, but because you are showing up differently, more honestly, more presently, less from the carefully managed performance, and more from genuine contact with who you actually are. As Gabor Mate's work consistently and compassionately reminds us, with patience, with rigor, with an extraordinary depth of human understanding, what was adapted in the service of survival can, with awareness and honest attention and time, gradually be unmade. Not to leave you with nothing, not to take away the sensitivity that is genuinely yours, but to give it back to you, whole, honest, rooted in something real, yours, finally, fully, honestly yours. If something in this conversation touched something real, if a particular moment landed in a way that was difficult to dismiss, take a genuine moment with that recognition. You don't have to resolve it today. You don't have to know exactly what comes next. Simply allowing yourself to see clearly, without judgment, without the rush to fix or perform or accommodate, is already something meaningful. Share your thoughts in the comments if you'd like. What resonated most honestly? What came up that you weren't expecting? And if thoughtful, psychologically grounded conversations like this one feel valuable to you, conversations that take the full complexity of human experience seriously, consider subscribing. There's much more ahead. Because understanding yourself, the real you, beneath all the accommodation, beneath all the performance of being fine, is always worth the effort. Always.